Welcome, everyone. My name is Jim Ryan. I'm the executive director of MERIP, and I'm really glad to be with you all today and welcome you to MERIP's launch event for our latest issue, Resistance, the Axis and Beyond. This is our first time hosting one of these events on our own and something we're hoping to do often this year. It's really just great to be with our community, our audience. We're very, very thankful for your support. MERIP is a small nonprofit, if you're unfamiliar with us, and it really runs on the support and comradeship of all of you in our audience and community of readers. So thank you for spreading the word, sharing the mission, and when possible, chipping in a few bucks to help us keep the lights on here. If you're new to us, I'll be sharing some links in the chat to our newsletter, the issue that we're going to talk about today, and a link to donate if you're inclined. On to our program. Today, we're joined by 5 contributors to Resistance, the Axis and Beyond, which was released just 2 weeks ago. We're going to have a moderated discussion of several of the pieces in the issue for about 45 minutes, and then open things up for discussion and audience questions after that. So I'll introduce everyone off the top, and then we'll start the discussion. So with us today are Kevin Schwartz, who is a member of our editorial committee and one of the lead editors of this issue. Kevin is deputy director of the Oriental Institute of the Czech Academy of Sciences in Prague, Czech Republic, where he also serves as a research fellow. He is coming to us today from Amman, Jordan. He also contributed a piece to this issue titled aptly "The End of the Axis of Resistance?" ? Following Kevin, we'll have Marya Hannun, MERIP's managing editor and a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter, which also happens to be one of our core partners at MERIP and a co-sponsor of this event. Thanks to all the folks who helped, all the folks there who helped make this event and happen and support us throughout all of our activities here at MERIP. Marya also contributed a really powerful essay to this issue titled "Breaking the Fourth Wall, Reading Sadala Wanus in a Time of Genocide." After Marya, we'll turn to Munira Khayyat, who is clinical associate professor at NYU Abu Dhabi. And we're very glad to have her essay in this issue, "A Dispatch from South Lebanon, or Life as Resistance at the End of the World." Following Munira, we'll go to Zachary Cuyler, an assistant professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Zach gave us a fantastic essay on the past and present of resistance and energy politics in Palestine, titled "Power Struggles, Energy as a Weapon of War, Domination, and Resistance in Palestine." And last, but certainly not least, we have Olmo Gölz, a senior lecturer in Islamic and Iranian studies at the Department for Oriental Studies at the University of Freiburg, who penned an insightful article on the role of the Islamic Republic in resistance to Israeli aggression, written with his co-author Ruth Vollmer, titled "Narratives of the Oppressed, the Dialectic of Resistance Behind the Axis." So we have a packed panel today, and to kick things off, I'm going to turn to Kevin Schwartz. Kevin, this issue came together over a six-month period where we saw the situation in Gaza deteriorate to a horrible extent. Yet another invasion of Lebanon by Israel, attacks against Hamas leaders inside Iran, the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, and 2 separate ICBM rocket attacks on Israel by Iran. I think it's safe to say that the dynamics of resistance as it pertains to the axis of resistance, the loose configuration of state and non-state actors engaged in military conflict with Israel, has changed dramatically in this period. And I'm sure that posed several challenges to editing an issue on the topic as it was developing. Can you tell us a bit about how the issue came together, how the editorial team met those challenges, Kevin?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first I'll give a little bit of background on the issue in general. I mean, it's a really well-rounded one, both in terms of content and genre, and I think it really showcases the very best of what MERIP has to offer, from these incredibly researched and thoughtful historical pieces like Zach's article on electricity in Palestine, to a dispatch from the region like Munira's piece on South Lebanon. And then we have these articles, as you noted, that are deeply tied to this very moment of confusion and contradiction, and how to understand the nature of resistance amidst all these unfolding dynamics in Lebanon, Gaza, where else? And you have Olmo's piece talking about Iran's ideology of the oppressed, or something similar dealing with unfolding dynamics, this time kind of outside the region, both inside and outside, is the kind of political theater of Western leaders performing their preordained scripts of support for Israel at all costs amidst a genocide, something I think Marya will touch upon when discussing her wonderful essay on the playwright Juanes and what it means to read his works in light of Gaza. And then beyond that, we had more essays again that were dealing with this moment, a look at the impact of October 7th and the Red Sea blockade on the garment industry in Jordan, as well as an essay on the Houthis by Helen Lackler and an essay by Maryam Alemzadeh on how the Islamic Republic of Iran has treated support for Palestine in the context of geostrategic interest. And all these things were in flux, and all these things needed to be kind of rethought and dealt with and contended with. And we started developing this issue in July of last year, and the idea was that its main focus, almost in its entirety, would be the axis of resistance. But with what transpired in Lebanon and Gaza and the ousting of Assad regime in Syria, we were faced with these new realities, and I think us as editors had to think really more earnestly about the framing of the issue, and some of the contributors had to really reevaluate their arguments and articles. And I think in the end, both editors and contributors achieved a real impressive result that didn't take any of these events lightly, but also didn't see them as some kind of definitive endpoints of what's happening in Gaza, Lebanon, or the region at large, but kind of inflection points that warranted a careful consideration embedded within their historically grounded analyses. So everyone kind of in their own way felt, figured out how to deal with current events, but still maintain some kind of groundedness with the kind of good historical or ethnographic work they had been doing prior to these new developments. Of course, in the end, the axis of resistance did feature really prominently in this issue. I mean, for better or worse, the resistance over the last 16 months has been tied up to the axis. And so I felt like I wanted to take up that issue in my essay, The End of the Axis of Resistance, ? In light of events in Syria. And in that essay, I just tried to address one main point. I think, as many of us know, the so-called axis comprises a consortium of actors with their own interests and agendas and agencies that exist and extend well beyond any relationship to Iran. So I just kind of think that a lot of the post-mortems that were coming out, that resistance by these actors will simply subside, not only vis-a-vis Israel, but U.S. hegemony in the region, because the axis may not be what it used to be, or Iran is weakened, as if the outlooks and attitudes and actions of these groups will suddenly change overnight, are simply premature. And we saw a lot of these post-mortems, and they're still kind of coming out. And, we just see a lot of these versions of this narrative all the time, where Iran occupies the entirety of the discourse when it comes to framing certain dynamics in the region, whether in terms of resistance or instabilities, if nothing else matters, like the agency of other actors or the impact of foreign meddling by the US and other states, which then naturally leads to calls like, well, if Iran's the problem, well, you just take out Iran as the source of all this resistance and instability, then the region's problems will be solved. It's really occupying quite a bit of space. And this type of thinking is really bipartisan, both among government officials in Washington and foreign policy elites. And there's tons of data points to point out here, but I'll just mention, if one wants to look at a recent essay in Foreign Affairs, the kind of house journal of foreign policy elites in the US, again, Iran is front and center here, with the policy being advocated to supply Israel with advanced weaponry that could destroy Iran's nuclear facilities, to be used as a threat, yes, but one to be backed up with action if necessary. And so when I hear these analyses of the acts of resistance ending or being destroyed, my ears kind of prick up, and I think of these two things, right? The lack of willingness to ascribe agency to actors beyond their attachment to Iran, and the kind of dangerous thinking of foreign policy elites that Iran is the cause of all the region's ills. And just kind of to bring it back to dynamics and your question about how things changed, I think while we contended with Iran in this issue in multiple ways and the access writ large, this was really an opportunity to give space to beginning to rethink and remember other types of resistance when it's not just being co-opted and occupied by Iran and some of these other actors. And so, with that kind of caveat in mind that it always doesn't begin and end with Iran, I look forward to hearing other people talk about their pieces that go beyond Iran. We have some that include Iran, but also go beyond Iran. And I think, as some of us on the Marab EdCom have talked about, I think it's an opportunity to explore what resistance might look like beyond the axis.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Yeah, thank you. That's a really great and helpful way to, I think, frame and the question of resistance and the issue at large. Marya, our intrepid managing editor, from your perspective, what can you tell us about the editorial process that should help us think through this narrative of resistance? And also, I know you made the decision to write about your experience reading the Syrian playwright Sadr al-Wanous in the midst of the Exeter liberation encampment for Palestine. How did the issue help crystallize your contribution, if I could put it that way?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thank you for moderating and organizing this conversation. And thank you to all the writers, again, for your really wonderful work in this issue. I could go on about the process of editing it, and I think Kevin did a really good job sort of outlining the challenges of trying to account for the changing dynamics, which is not a pace at which Marab usually operates. We tend to take a little bit more time and also try to publish work that has a longer shelf life that will still be sort of relevant and analytically sound in years to come, unlike some of our friends writing or foreign affairs and other places that are much more reacting to political dynamics in the moment. And at the same time, we are, grappling with our own politics as an organization that very much sits on the US left and globally critical of US hegemony and imperialism in the region as a kind of, and we had in this issue a really wonderful obituary by Judith Tucker, sort of reflecting on the legacy of Joe Stork, who founded Marab with this goal of connecting US imperialism in the region with Palestine, with Zionism, and really pushing that to the center of the way the left thinks about the Middle East in the United States. That was his sort of original project. And so we were trying to keep the spirit of this as well at the center of the issue at a time when it feels like the left is a bit fragmented around some of these questions about resistance. And so we didn't want to weigh in definitively. We wanted to grapple with the complexity of that, which anytime you're trying to do that makes editing really challenging, but very, I think the issue sort of speaks to the complexity. And yeah, one of the ways that we wanted to do that is talking about resistance in its many forms and iterations. And so I wrote about the student encampments. We wanted to write about the student encampments that began last spring at Columbia University and then spread to hundreds of institutions, 100, maybe, I don't know the exact number, but, throughout the United States and the UK, where I'm currently based, as one version of resistance to this ongoing genocide that has really been enabled by Western support. And at the University of Exeter, which I write about, students set up an encampment that was demanding the university divest from research partnerships in line with the academic boycott, that it sever the projects that feed into weapons technologies and the physics and other departments. And the space of the encampment, both at Exeter and around various universities, was a really important site of political activation over the past year, evidenced by the backlash that they really elicited from the powers that be, and they continue to elicit. And they were sites of escalation and of disruption, and also sites of learning and dialogue that, again, were just inherently political, and a kind of political work being done outside of the classroom and outside of sort of traditional knowledge production. And so the piece I wrote was centered around the work of Saadallah Wanous, who we read at the encampment. And we read a play by him called The Adventure of the Mamluk Jaber's Head, in Arabic, Mughamarat Ras al-Mamluk Jaber. And it's been translated by Robert Myers and Neda Saab in an anthology that they published with Yale University Press in 2019, which I highly recommend as a teaching tool for English language students. And I won't get into the play in depth. You can read the article. But I really wrote about how the play speaks to a period of Wanous's work in which he was that also in turn speaks to the war in Gaza and resistance to the war, and Israel and US, its US-backed project of genocidal violence in the region. Because Wanous wrote this play following the June War in 1967, at a time when he was grappling with how theater could be a form of resistance. And along with several playwrights who he was in contact with, they were sort of pioneering this way of thinking about theater as breaking the fourth wall, in line with like this Brechtian idea of breaking the fourth wall and really getting participants, the audience, to participate in the action of theater and really feel their own implication in the drama that they're witnessing, as a way to politicize them outside of theater. And he really thought that theater could be this inciting place to challenge the social scripts and the political scripts that keep us glued to our seats. So I was writing about his various techniques of doing this. And for me, they really recall what we've seen over the past year, because he wanted to actually use the moment of watching a play to get the audience to stand up and interrupt the action. So he would have actors sitting in the audience and asking questions of the actors in the play. And he was trying to simulate for the audience, like, you guys can do this too. And for me, this really recalls what we've seen over the past year, the kinds of disruptions at different in terms of political theater, at rallies, political rallies, at universities, foreign policy institutes, where there's sort of a narrative being presented and activists are disrupting that narrative. And the discomfort that causes makes this disruption really effective as a tool of political action. And Wanous really believed in this power of theater, and it's something that we've seen over the past year in these disruptive acts. And so I was kind of thinking with these two examples of the past and the present, and writing about how Wanous really sparked this in the Exeter encampment. And I don't want to ramble too much, so I'm going to stop, but I will just say, I'll kind of end on this note, that reading the plays at the encampment really sparked a dialogue for us, because Mamluk Jaber, the play itself, is a kind of warning to the audience that being passive, that keeping your head down and allowing oppression to kind of continue as long as you're not in the line of fire, will eventually doom us all. And so for us at the encampment, it was an inversion of this refrain we hear all the time, that Palestine will liberate us all. And we thought, the opposite is also true, that failing to resist can really mire us in these widening circuits of oppression. And I don't even think I have to point out the ways we're seeing that now. It's obvious to everyone in this room. And so I think, thinking with this past work is really helpful for me now. And the final point I'll end on, because I really do want to note this about Wanous and his work. 67 was a moment of military defeat. And I think for many people, it felt like defeat of resistance movements. And for Wanous, it was not. And for Wanous, what really was a moment of defeat was the normalization, which he saw as the sort of opposite of, and the most dangerous force when it comes to the power of resistance. And I think thinking about that, about normalization as the sort of kryptonite for mobilization, can kind of help us think through our own organizing and activism in this moment. So I'll leave it there. I could talk forever about it, but please read the issue, and I'm happy to answer questions as well.
Thank you so much, Marya. I mean, the piece really does make you think about protest and disruption whenever you see it differently. Certainly, it called. I mean, of all places, called. It was called to my mind in the midst of the Super Bowl halftime show last night. Which was its own sort of text disrupted again by that we understand. By a dancer holding a flag that stitched together the Palestinian and Sudanese flags. I want to turn to Munira Khayyat. Your piece both reflects on your recent and past experiences following Israeli invasions of Lebanon, and comes, I think, in a long tradition of Merit dispatches, in similar circumstances, stretching all the way back to 1982. Could you please tell us, what you saw this past fall in southern Lebanon, and how does it help us situate the most recent invasion in a historical perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Thank you, Marya, also for speaking so eloquently. I was reminded about 67. I wanted to just comment on that. During this terrible war that we just lived through, I called my aunt to reference kind of like refer to the older generation for some sort of insight into the moment that we were living. And it occurred to me that maybe I should ask whether the feeling right now was similar to the feeling of 67. And I thought maybe that would be a nice anchor for the sort of the overwhelming, events that we were living through. So I told my aunt, is what we were living through similar to how you were, feeling in 67? And she burst out laughing. And she said to me, no, Auntie, right now it feels much, much worse. So just to kind of like put that in perspective as well, because of what you were just talking about. So, I mean, for me, that was actually not what I expected. That wasn't the answer I expected at all. Because for me, in my sort of perspective on 67, that was the worst moment that we ever lived through regionally. And now it feels somehow even worse for those who lived through it. Okay, so I'm going to show a couple of pictures, and I'm going to speak to the question, which is how does this moment and then what we're living through put my work in South Lebanon in perspective, or sort of adjust my understandings of the realities that people live through. And I'm just going to share my screen. And okay, can you see it? Right. Oh, I can't seem to. Right. Sorry. All right. Okay, so I work in I'm an anthropologist, and I worked in South Lebanon after the last big war to blow over the area in 2006. And the village that I worked in is Ramia. It centers my ethnography on life and war in South Lebanon, but it's not named in the book. But now I'm going to name it because the realities have shifted a little bit. This is one of the frontline villages. So it's one of the 37 villages that have been destroyed right now by Israel, and it's one of the frontline villages that basically are called, they're called the sorry, they're called. They used to exist in what was called الشريط الحدود المحتل. So they right now are still under occupation, and most of them have been reclaimed by their inhabitants. I'm going to just give a couple of dates to put us all in perspective. So in October 8th of last year, the war started in South Lebanon, one day after the Tufan al-Aqsa in Gaza. And from October 8th until September 23rd, 2024, the war sort of stayed in South Lebanon. Israel was bombing South Lebanon every day. It was focusing mainly on the agricultural landscapes of South Lebanon. South Lebanon is a place where people live off the land. They're tobacco farmers and olive croppers, and they keep goats as livestock. Those are the ecologies that I call resistant in my work, because they are ecologies that actually are able to sustain themselves through cycles and seasons of war. And so from on September 23rd, 2024, the war escalated and became sort of a wider war on Lebanon. And that moment also, the Israelis escalated in South Lebanon and started to really, make the ability of people to stay there impossible. And many people fled. So 1.5 million people fled from the south, and the south was pretty much occupied except for the military resistance that remained there. On November 27th, so 2 months after that war escalated at this level, killing around 4,000 people and wounding 16,000. There was a ceasefire that was called, that was agreed on both sides, and that was on November 27th, 2024, and it was supposed to last for 60 days. So 60 days went until January 26th, 2025, and I wrote the piece that in the merit piece during this moment of ceasefire. So it was before the ceasefire ended, which it ended on January 26, 2025. And that night, all the Southerners rushed back to their villages, and even though the Israelis insisted that they were not going to leave. And so during the period of this 60-day ceasefire, the Israelis actually advanced into the frontline villages, and they blew them up. 37 of them there have been completely blown up. Here are some images of the villages that have been destroyed, and Ramya is one of them. And I just want to share with you some of those images so that you can understand the level of devastation, not only to homes and stone, but also to the landscape itself, the living landscape, the ecologies that really underpin life there. So I want to hold just kind of the military and the living sort of in sort of the same frame right now. And here I just want to share this video while I talk. If I can silence it though. No. Silence it. Okay. So so this is where we are right now. The ceasefire has been extended until February 18th, and which means basically that the Israeli forces have not withdrawn from South Lebanon. Some of the villages are still occupied, especially in the eastern sector. So like Meis Jabal and Aitarun and Kfar Kila and Ribat Latin. These are villages that still have presence of the Israeli occupying forces. Now, some of the folks that I know from Ramya have actually made it back to their village. It's unlivable, as you can see. This is a drone footage of the village as it looks right now. It's devastating for those who have lived through endless decades and seasons of war, to even sort of see the level of devastation that their village is now currently under. Their village is currently experiencing. Right now it's February, so it's the beginning of the planting season. There have been images of folks returning to their villages, and they're showing them on social media as forms of resistance. People are actually going and trying to plant their land, but it's actually really problematic right now. But as you can see, that some villages are still have military presence in them. So how does this reality compare to what I have seen and what I have studied in those villages, it's a really difficult moment. It's a moment of limn, as I call it. It's sort of like this suspension between, I mean, the ceasefire is kind of this moment holding in abeyance the sort of realities that are going to come crashing down on our heads, and the sort of the understanding of where resistance is going to lie. There's military on one side, and there's the living resistance of people on the other. As an anthropologist, I've always looked at the living side of resistance, the resistance as life, resistance as planting, resistance as ecologies, as the capacity of people to withstand, right, and stand up to the devastating, annihilating realities that war brings to their door and to their lives. So what I saw just from the folks that I'm close to and who I know in Ramya, I was able to go after the first ceasefire to the south, but I didn't go to the border villages. I went to Nabatea and its environment, and there already, I mean, people are rebuilding their, as you can see, also images from Gaza. People are sweeping away the rubble and reestablishing themselves in their homes, because this to them is the most important point of return. And in South Lebanon as well, people are doing this. In the villages itself, I mean, the folks I'm close to in Ramya are returning to their homes, the rubble of their homes, during the day. It's actually now the cold season and there's snow and storms, so they can't really live there because there's no shelter. But they're trying to replant their crops. It's unknown what's going to happen on February 18th, which is the second moment of the end of a ceasefire, which is really not a ceasefire. It was the moment the Israelis took to actually occupy and destroy as much as possible. So just to finally, to conclude, I mean, how does this look in comparison to what I've seen? I mean, I feel very optimistic that at the level of life, there will always be resistance. And this will always, I mean, and of course, at the level of military resistance, this will reassemble and reemerge and reassert itself as long as there's occupation. So I think that it's impossible to consider a situation where that the resistance has been definitively dealt a blow as long as occupation continues. And so I'm going to just end on that point, and maybe I could address questions in the later session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Munira. And it really is a powerful reminder that resistance, especially framed this way, is in so many ways ineradicable, right? Yeah. I want to turn now to Zach Cuyler. Zach, your piece powerfully argues for the issue of energy sovereignty as fundamental to any progress towards peace or justice in Palestine, and that the status quo maintains the Israeli siege that predated October 7th in so many ways. Based on your research, how should we understand Palestinian resistance differently in this light?
Well, thank you, Jem. And so, first of all, I just want to thank you and the entire Marip team, Marya and Kevin for hosting me today and for giving me space to kind of think these things through with you. So this is a historical piece, and so I'm gonna try to answer that question by kind of walking through the history. And so I started researching this particular topic, basically energy and Israel's assembly of an energy system that enabled siege in places like Gaza, but also the West Bank. Specifically because I noticed that a lot of the reporting on Israeli siege tactics, especially things like the basically absolute cutoff of supplies of electricity and fuel, which, just to be clear, was explicitly genocidal, explicitly aimed at making Gaza uninhabitable. A lot of this reporting kind of took for granted that it was possible, right? It was sort of assumed already that Israel would have control over something as fundamental as the supply of electricity, or something like water, or something like food, right? And I think that this took a lot of work and a lot of, I mean, just to use a word that we've already used today, normalization, in order for it to be kind of assumed that Israel could impose such a punishing siege on the population of Gaza. And then throughout this whole, grinding year and a half of war, you kept hearing the Biden administration and European governments talk about returning to this two-state formula once the war was concluded, an idea that like the outcome of this somehow would be a sovereign, independent Palestinian state. But what it seemed to me that without fundamentally changing the kinds of infrastructural arrangements that made the siege possible, Palestinians would be permanently vulnerable to basically extermination as siege tactics, and that under those conditions, there could be no such thing as substantive sovereignty. And so I wanted to understand basically the enabling conditions that made Israel's cutoff of Gaza's energy supply possible. To understand that, we need to go back to the mandate period. Fred Mayton has written a very good book on this. Other people have also written about it. And to the history of a company called the Palestine Electric Company, or PEC, which was founded by a Russian Zionist engineer named Pinchas Rutenberg, who also incidentally helped found the Haganah. This company held a monopoly concession over power provision in most of the Palestine Mandate, except for Jerusalem, which I'll return to later. And this company, just invested more in electricity infrastructure in areas of Jewish settlement, in part because of racialized assumptions that the Yishuv would be more productive, more modern, more industrial, and therefore would make better consumers for electricity. But the PEC also specifically invested in electricity infrastructure throughout the mandate, and especially in areas of majority Jewish settlement, with the sort of stated goal of helping build a Jewish state in Palestine. So it fostered the creation of industrial facilities in places like Haifa and Tel Aviv, and then also helped pave the way for the establishment of agricultural colonies in places like the Jordan Valley, right? So the PEC, Mayton argues that the PEC helped reinforce and really undergird the N-shaped pattern of settlement that you saw in Mandate Palestine. The PEC also enforced its monopoly concession against Arab communities that wanted to build their own grids and get access to power independently. And in so doing, participated in a not total, but pretty systematic denial of electricity to Arab communities throughout the mandate period. The PEC would even enforce its monopoly against Arab communities that it saw as too small or traditional to demand very much electricity. So it thought that these, towns and villages would not be profitable places to invest, and nonetheless enforced its monopoly rights against them so that they couldn't build their own grid infrastructure. And so as, part of this played a really central role in the uneven development of Mandate Palestine, as people like Mayton have argued, such that by the Nakba in 1948, about 30% of the population of historic Palestine was Jewish, but this 30% consumed about 90% of the electricity generated there. And so you can go from this first phase of uneven development, which extended broadly from the 1920s to about 1967, to the 1967 war, in which Israel conquered Gaza, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai. And the Israel Electric Company, IEC, the PEC's successor company, began extending electricity to Palestinian communities in the West Bank and Gaza. And so it actually began giving Palestinians greater and greater access to electricity, but in the process, it gradually undermined existing Palestinian power companies and fostering these companies' dependence on the Israeli grid. In November of 1967, Israel issued Military Order 159, such that military authorities had to sign off on the assembly of any new power infrastructure, intended not to give authorization unless this infrastructure connected Palestinian communities to the grid. And so just to illustrate the outcome of this process, this is a chart of the independent production of the Jerusalem District Electricity Company. This is a Palestinian-owned and run company providing electricity in and around the city of Jerusalem. Comes from an older Ottoman concession. And so in 1966, this company produced all of its own electricity, sold this electricity to Palestinian consumers. Gradually, it was required to provide electricity to new Jewish settlements as well as the IDF. And while it was allowed to expand its facilities to an extent, it wasn't allowed to expand fast enough to meet demand. And so gradually across about 2 decades, this company went from generating 100% of its own electricity to provide to consumers to generating about 3% of its own electricity, and was almost exclusively involved in the business of selling Israeli-generated electricity to Palestinian and other consumers. The Oslo process, which I'm sure everybody here knows, was hypothetically aimed at creating an independent sovereign Palestinian state, but actually, in fact, consolidated Palestinian independence. To a large extent, Palestinian independence was consolidated via the energy sector. So I'll just give a few examples of how that worked. Palestinians were required to import fuel that met US and EU standards. This fuel was only regionally refined in Israel, so Palestinians couldn't buy fuel from places like Egypt or Jordan, which followed other standards, looser standards. Israel was given the right to withhold tax revenues from the PA in order to pay down Palestinian electricity debt to the IEC. And so the growing Palestinian dependence on Israeli electricity produced debt that Israel could then use to withhold revenue from the PA, which it's doing now in order perhaps to collapse the PA and annex the West Bank. The Oslo era saw the planning and construction of a power plant in Gaza, which was finished, I think, in 2002. And this Gaza power plant might have represented kind of the core of an independent Palestinian energy system, but it was dependent on Israeli fuel. And so if the Israeli authorities ever decided to cut off this plant's fuel supply, which they frequently did, then Palestinians could no longer, in Gaza, could no longer generate their own electricity. And so this growing Palestinian energy dependence meant that Israel could cut off energy as a counterinsurgency tactic, which Israel did regularly first in the first and second intifadas, but even going back into the early 1980s. And then finally, there was a third phase, which Olmo Salamanca has called the remote control occupation, going from about 2007 onward, when Gaza was declared a hostile territory by Israel following Hamas's victory in Palestinian elections and takeover of the Gaza Strip. And so in this period, there was Israel basically practiced the sustained denial of energy as a siege tactic. This was persistent, but it intensified during periods of fighting like in 2008 and 2014 and 2021. And so the accumulation of this broader, longer pattern of uneven development, plus dependence on Israeli fuel supply, having to purchase Israeli electricity at high cost, having to purchase Israeli fuel at high cost, plus these siege tactics with their intensification, and then also sometimes just the straightforward bombing of energy infrastructure in Gaza created severe energy poverty in Gaza. So one way of seeing this is in the availability of electricity. You can see that Gazans received from the grid only between 7 and 13 hours of electricity per day from 2017 to 2023, or the first 9 months of 2023. And you can see that, some proportion, the majority of this came directly from Israel, and a smaller proportion of this electricity came from Gaza's power plant, which again was Israeli fueled. And so already by 2011, Olmo Salamanca argued that Israel had the capacity through its control over these kinds of infrastructures to create possibilities for life or induce failure and death. And what we saw in October of 2023 wasn't anything fundamentally new, as everybody here knows, but was just sort of an intensification of the kinds of tactics that Israel had already been using for quite some time. So Israel, cut off the flow of electricity and fuel by October 8th. with catastrophic consequences for healthcare, for wastewater treatment, for desalination. And so you can see, right, Gazans got about 14 hours of electricity per day in early October. By the 8th, that supply was reduced to 4 hours from the grid a day. That was while the Gaza power plant was running through the last of its fuel. And then finally, by October 11th, there was zero electricity coming from the grid. And Gazans became totally dependent upon private diesel generators and solar panels. And so you can see the impact of this. I mean, many of you have probably seen this before, but you can see the impact of this really clearly from images, satellite images of nighttime illumination in the Gaza Strip. So this is a satellite photograph of lights in Gaza in September of 2023. You can see from north to south Gaza City, Hannun, Rafah, right? You can see the outline of Gaza's population, right? And already by the 21st of October 2023, you see a really stark decrease in the amount of electricity available to people. Again, this by now, this primarily would have been coming from private diesel generators, solar plants in places like hospitals, right, critical facilities. And then by January 1st, the strip is almost entirely dark. So you can see this very, very starkly. And so to come back to the question of resistance, and this maybe dovetails with the way that Munira is thinking about it, what I see is basically two kind of distinct but interrelated models. So first, this should be familiar to everybody, is steadfastness. So in this instance, that means assembling and maintaining locally controlled energy sources so that people can survive and under certain conditions, do more than survive. And so this has been ongoing for a very long time. Gazans began adopting solar panels to heat their water all the way back in the 1970s. Gazans adopted solar power for electricity at a really high rate in the 2010s when they were under siege, but somewhat independent from Israeli control. In this image here, there's a kid who's about 15 years old, who's nicknamed the Newton of Gaza, who has figured out how to build small wind turbines that could be placed at the tops of tents to charge things like phones and batteries. And now there's a strong preference among, understandably, among people who work for Gaza's municipality and the Gaza Electricity Distribution Company to depend on distributed solar power with batteries, because these provide resilience, but also critically independence, because Gazans will understandably never again trust a power supply coming from Israel. And then the second model is one of sabotage, right? You can think about it as sabotage, meaning the destruction or damaging of the physical infrastructure that sustains settler colonialism, uneven development, and the kind of dependence that has made Palestinians so vulnerable. So Fred Mayton has written about acts of sabotage against the PEC in the Mandate period. These acts of sabotage were attempts to slow the assembly of a grid and the kind of exclusionary state building project that it supported. But then also there were acts of sabotage by groups like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which, as you can see in this image, destroyed power lines connecting Ashdod to new settlements in the Naqab or Negev desert in the late 1960s, which were incidentally funded in part by USAID. And so what does all this tell us about resistance in general, or Palestinian resistance in particular? And so one way, I think Munira has put this really beautifully. One way to think about resistance is that it constitutes basically the struggle for control over conditions of life. And here I've been thinking about that as the struggle for substantive sovereignty. But then also, I would argue that certain acts of resistance constitute an argument, and you could think about it as a theoretical argument, that they reveal certain relationships, especially relationships of uneven development, settler colonialism, empire, and apartheid, by disrupting those relationships, specifically by destroying their material bases. Okay, so I'll stop there, and I'd be happy to talk more in the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Zach. Really, I learned so much from reading your essay, but also reviewing it in your presentation just now. It's really, it's staggering, to think about how intertwined and deep and materially constructed the occupation and the siege are and have been. Finally, again, last but not least, but thank you for being very patient, Olmo Gölz. I want to turn to your piece with Ruth Vollmer, which I think helps us understand the role of resistance to Israeli aggression and occupation in Palestine, and how it's kind of baked into the ideology of the Islamic Republic of Iran. How do you see this role and ideology changing, or if at all, if it changes at all, in the past 16 months since October 7th?
Yeah, Jim, first of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss our article here, and also, of course, for including our article, Kevin, Marya, in the first place in this very important special issue. The question how the role and ideology of resistance within the Islamic Republic of Iran or in the region, in the wider region, have changed over the past 60 months is, or has to be approached, I would say, in two ways. First, I'd say ideology is never static. It adapts to material conditions. So yes, the ideology of resistance has shifted, as is natural in response to evolving realities. And second, assessing Iran's role within the axis of resistance requires both empirical and theoretical insights. While the binary worldview that Iran helped forge remains strong, Iran's own position, we argue, Ruth and I argue, within this framework is increasingly in question. At the very least, we can observe an erosion of its credibility. To explain this further, let me take the opportunity to circle back a little bit to the ideas that drove Ruth Vollmer, my co-author, and me while writing this piece. I mean, our contribution to this special issue examines the ideological foundations of the axis of resistance and not the lived realities, and particularly how the concept of resistance to Israeli occupation has been embedded in the Islamic Republic of Iran's self-perceptions. So our piece explores the ideological underpinnings of the axis of resistance, particularly how the concept of resistance to Israeli occupation is embedded in the Islamic Republic of Iran's self-perception, as I've said. What is important to know, I mean, is that neither Ruth nor I are political scientists. We approach this topic from the perspective of sociology and Islamic studies, particularly the sociology of religion. We have observed that much of the discourse, particularly in German public debate, attributes Middle Eastern crises to sectarianism, reducing conflicts to internal Islamic divisions. At the same time, the existence of the axis of resistance is often oddly taken for granted, as if it were natural, a static alliance, despite the fact that it includes vastly different religious currents, obviously and successfully transgressing sectarian boundaries. For sure, political science has contributed much to our understanding. I give political scientists to our understanding of the axis by focusing on the strategic dimension, how Iran's alliances function as deterrence mechanisms or geopolitical counterweights, for example. While this is crucial, we found it important to add another layer by examining the ideological foundation that binds these, in many aspects, heterogeneous actors together. While we do not object to perspectives focusing on strategy or alliance cohesion from a realist perspective, we find it odd that the ideological dimension is often overlooked. It is not merely a matter of needing a common enemy to bridge ideological differences, though in the case of the axis of resistance, precisely this shared ideological framework has successfully held the axis together for over a decade. And in turn, we assume that this does something with the concept of resistance, thus the very term that the special issue we are talking about today is focused on. In this regard, the question of change you just raised, Jim, is basically an important aspect of our starting point, since our work is deeply informed by conceptual history, if you will, particularly in relation to the Iranian Revolution. One of the key concepts that emerged from the revolution is the Mustasafin-Mustakbarin dichotomy, the division between the oppressed and the arrogant oppressors. And this is super important to understand the Islamic Revolution, as you all know, because this binary framing challenges classical Marxist perspective on revolution by shifting the focus from purely material conditions to moral and spiritual dimensions of struggle. And in our piece, we argue that the axis of resistance reproduces this logic, structuring its worldview around a similar binary opposition. It is not that you see the term Mustasafin always popping up, but sometimes it will. But the important thing is that the worldview is structured around the similar binary opposition. And this ideological framing has allowed it to unify diverse actors under a shared moral vision. Examining the discourses of different actors, whether Hezbollah, Ansarullah, or Iran itself, reveals how this binary worldview shaped the self-perception and legitimacy of the axis. And this is what we were trying to do in our piece. But to answer your question on this changing aspects of ideology and the role of Iran, I think we need to consider sorry for being overly theoretic now, but for the Hegelian structure of domination and recognition. The Mustasafin discourse is not merely about material deprivation, as I said, but about dignity and visibility. In this framework, true resistance, and this is important, emerges from those who are willing to sacrifice everything in the struggle against oppression. This is the Hegelian perspective, which has been prominently woven into a third worldist perspective, of course. Sorry. But this now creates a theoretical dilemma. Can the oppressed maintain their status as Mustasafin once they become a hegemonic power? And the Islamic Republic of Iran has long positioned itself as the leader of the oppressed, but this role has become increasingly difficult to uphold. The binary framing of global politics persists, of course, reinforced by the ongoing war in Gaza, broader regional conflicts, and emerging policy directions, for example, from the new Trump administration on Gaza. And the realities of oppression and the living resistance, as Munira put it, also still exists, of course. But the issue at hand for us, for Ruth and I, is not whether this conceptualization is actually challenged, but rather who retains the authority to present themselves as the vanguard of the oppressed, if you will. As these ideological tensions mount, the more pressing question is whether Iran still qualifies as part of the oppressed. Over the past 16 months, significant shifts have occurred that call this into question, I would say. The war in Gaza and broader regional conflict have highlighted contradiction in Iran's ideological positioning. While Iran continues to express rhetorical support for the Palestinian cause, its strategic choices suggest caution. The Islamic Republic has refrained from escalating beyond controlled engagements, a hesitation that has drawn criticism, of course, within the axis, but it can also be increasingly questioned whether Iran still positions itself as a vanguard of the oppressed, or if it now prioritizes maintaining regional influence over ideological commitments. This is particularly evident in Syria, of course, where the fall of Bashar al-Assad in December 2024 marked a turning point, I would say, demonstrating the limits of Iran's influence. Also, Hezbollah, once a formidable force in Lebanon, has also been weakened by prolonged engagement with Israel. Hamas, as you know, after 16 months of relentless Israeli military campaigns, faces an existential crisis, In each case, Iran's commitment has been largely rhetorical, raising question about its ability or willingness to act as the defender of the oppressed in practice. And while much of this remains speculative, we can observe an erosion of Iran's credibility within the Axis. And a telling example, which some of you might have seen via social media, can be found in a banner that appeared shortly after al-Assad's fall in the souk of Damascus under the headline "Iran is terrorist," stating that behind the rhetoric of resistance and the call to liberate Palestine lay a different agenda by Iran, the ambition of the Islamic Republic to dominate Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq, not the actual liberation of Palestine. So the Mostasafin narrative hinges on self-sacrifice and defiance. This is the theoretical point, meaning that if Iran is perceived as calculating and self-preserving rather than fully committed, it risks undermining the ideological coherence of the Axis. This is both a theoretical and an empirical issue. Theoretically, the Hegelian structure of resistance requires confrontation. Eventually, the oppressed must challenge the master. This is what Hegel said. Empirically, Iran's reluctance to risk everything in Gaza, Syria, or Lebanon suggests a shift in its strategic priorities, one that may ultimately weaken its ability to maintain its narrative. So looking forward, the question is whether Iran can recalibrate its ideological framework to reconcile its role as both a state actor, and this is different to this lived resistance we heard about before, and a revolutionary force. And the Mostasafin discourse has been remarkably flexible, allowing Iran to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining its legitimacy. But if its credibility continues to erode, we may see shifts in how resistance is conceptualized within the region, maybe shifts that also, like the point Kevin made, that all these different actors have the agency, have their own agency, and are not so much let's say, bound to this leadership of Iran. But the ideological recalibration, whether voluntary or forced, will shape the future trajectory of the Axis. And I leave it with that. Thank you for listening to me, and I look forward to our discussion, of course.
Thank you so much, Olmo. And I certainly think that this is the question you're grappling with in the essay and this presentation. I think is one that I think everyone who's been paying attention to what's been going on over the last 16 months is, especially since the collapse of the Assad regime in December, trying to puzzle out. I mean, you have a really dramatically altered and changing landscape of armed resistance, and it just by necessity is going to require a reevaluation of each actor's role in that framework. And your essay does a really nice job of helping us think our way through that. I want to turn things over to some audience discussion here. As I said in the chat, please feel free to put questions into the chat, either to everyone here or in a direct message to myself if you'd like, or take an opportunity to raise your hand and ask a question verbally. I have received a couple in the chat already, so I think I'll start there. And sort of a point of order, there was a question in the chat about print issues or PDF issues of MERIP. I will say PDFs of every MERIP issue, going back to the very first issues of MERIP in the 1970s, are available through JSTOR if you have access to JSTOR. There will be a PDF copy of this issue available on JSTOR within a few months. If you don't have access to JSTOR and would like a PDF of an issue, shoot me an email and I'll try and get one to you. So I'm going to start posing this question from the chat from Mark Levine. And I'll read it back if it's okay, so we have context for those of you watching on YouTube. Mark says, a very powerful issue. Thanks to all the contributors and editors for putting it together. I would like to know what other models of resistance from outside the region are relevant today in this discussion. I think that's on the table for anyone. I should also say Marya had to leave us a little bit early, but we really thank her for being here. But for those of you that are here, Olmo, Zach, Kevin, Munira, you want to take up the issue of models of resistance from beyond the Middle East that might be applicable to think through our present moment? Go ahead, Kevin.
I'll say it's a great question. I don't really have an answer. I will turn it to a model of resistance here that isn't talked about, and certainly it's replicated in different places. I'm here in Amman, Jordan, and one of the things that I've seen, there's an incredible amount of, I think, forlornness and despair and hopelessness amongst the population, as you can imagine, being here, tied to so many people in Palestine. One of the things that it has changed here is the turn toward local producers, non-American products, products that have no kind of relation with Israel in any way. One thing that's been really interesting to observe over the past, 16 months has been the rise of Matrix Soda, which is a Jordanian company, which you no longer find local souks or shawarma or falafel shops selling Pepsi or Coke. You have, something like Matrix, and you've also had Carrefour, the big French grocery chain that was based here. They shut down recently in November as a result of a BDS movement that started prior to October 7th, but I think really picked up steam after October 7th. And it was owned. The chain here was owned by an Arab conglomerate based out of the Emirates, and they rebranded to a locally produced Arab-only grocery store. So that's not really to answer your question, Mark. I mean, I'm here in the region, so I can't really observe or think about things happening back in the US. But just to tell you that, I mean, that is a little bit of hope to see a model of resistance in terms of boycotting and turning to more locally sourced goods that I think is kind of a silver lining here.
Yeah, I think that's one very important for sure.
Thank you, Mark. Go ahead, Munira. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Munira.
I just wanted to say that in Lebanon, I mean, resistance is historically and practically, I mean, tied to Palestinian resistance, right? So Lebanon and Palestine, the enemy is one, and the resistance to the occupation and the violence, the invasion, the genocide, the ecocide of this one enemy is a unified cause, right? So I just wanted to speak to that. I mean, I think Mark was asking about different forms of resistance, and I just really wanted to just connect, and I insist on this in my work. And I mean, in South Lebanon as well, the landscape is continuous, right, with the landscape of Palestine. And I think it's really important to also think of those struggles as those resistance struggles as unified, not at the ideological level, but also at the, the actual, resistance to the same, deadly enemy. I just wanted to point that out.
No, absolutely. That I mean, again, yeah, we have to think, regionally in that sense, in so many ways. Mark, did you want to respond?
Just briefly, because I guess I should have put it in the first thing. I mean, just because I've spent a lot of time in Chiapas, and obviously there's a radical difference, even just geographically, topographically, between being in the La Condon jungle and being in Palestine, which is an far more securitized, completely monitored, completely controlled space. But there is a lot of interest there in dialoguing and working more with Palestinians. I have colleagues, Linda Kikiewicz, some of you might know her, whose amazing new book just came out, Palestine 1492, one of the few people who's a geographer working in Palestine, but also in Chiapas. And she's indigenous Guatemalan, I think. But she has also explored these relationships. I'm just wondering, and I guess part of the question raises also issues of how one conceives of what liberation is, issues of sovereignty, what is possible futures. These are all very difficult and complex questions, but we were actually trying to organize actually your predecessor at Merup a delegation to Chiapas before COVID of Palestinian activists, but it didn't quite work then because COVID happened and that was the end of it. But still, I think it's still a place where a real praxis is trying to be imagined, this combination of theory and action that's very responsive and on the ground that still has a lot to offer, even though the conditions in most ways are not nearly as difficult as Palestine. But yeah, that's just one example. There were a lot of activists from Rojava, for example, who used to go to Chiapas regularly. Now, again, Rojava is also very different. But just trying to imagine what other places there are that can be in dialogue to think through when it comes to Palestine, in particular, given the unique challenges that is faced for any form of resistance there against the overwhelming power of the Israeli state. Anyway, thank you.
Right. No, thank you, Mark. And I think that's a really fantastic point. And I should say, over the course of this issue coming together, we also had to, we were putting this together during the election season, sort of witnessing alongside here, in the United States, the growth of the uncommitted movement, the protests that we addressed, on campuses through Marya's piece. There's all, I think we witnessed here in the United States, if I can speak to that experience a little bit, like, a real thing, really thinking through solidarity with Palestine at a number of different levels where it hadn't really quite been so prominent before. In the context of a national political party, in the context of labor movements, in the context of of campus organizing, where it may have existed, at certain points in the past at a much quieter level, it was quite a bit louder in the past year, and I think we're still kind of waiting to see the real fruit of that, if there is to be any. So I think that's maybe also another way of thinking through what's happening around the world and how it impinges on and comes back to resistance in the region. I want to turn to another question, and we've received several in the chat, so I'm really grateful for all of the interaction here. I have a question here from Gabriel Young that's for Munira. Gabriel, thanks everybody on the panel, and it appreciates everyone's emphasis on everyday resistance rather than ideologies rather than party ideologies of resistance. So his question for Munira: has the discourse of Momane in Lebanon, maybe as a synonym for Mukavima, I'm not sure, honestly, he says, changed how you specifically approached Mukavima in the frontline villages? Was Momane a relevant reference point for communities you spent time with? And apologies, my Arabic, I come from a Turkish studies background myself, but if I mangled the pronunciation there of the Arabic terms, apologies in advance. Munira.
Yeah, so I can speak to Muqawama. Muqawama it means resistance in Arabic, and in Lebanon there's a long history of Muqawama at the level at the military level that culminates and then also comes to be kind of monopolized by Hezbollah in the since 82 onwards, since the Palestinians were the PLO was kicked out of Lebanon. So in my work in South Lebanon, I look at Muqawama like as a modality of resisting annihilation at the level of being and living, which is basically the level that most people, engage with resistance in those worlds. And then, of course, there's the military resistance, which is referred to as al-Muqawama, which is synonymous today with Hezbollah. And in South Lebanon, and in my work, of course, my work is in ethnography, and it's really insists on looking at those worlds that are often sort of overdetermined by their political actors, or sort of like, dominated by understandings around, or stereotypical understandings as well, around the political actors that dominate in the region. So in South Lebanon, it's a very diverse demographic. Not everybody in South Lebanon is Shia, not everybody is Hezbollah, but Hezbollah is the military resistance in Lebanon. So my work as an ethnographer and as an anthropologist really looked at the diversity of resistance as rooted in agricultural seasons and the land and being in place through seasons of devastation. And if you look at the ways in which Israel has waged war in Lebanon, but also in Palestine, it has shifted more and more. I mean, not even really, but like it's always been focusing on the eradication of life and on genocide. But in the latest round, really life was in the crosshairs of the war machine. And so in South Lebanon, you have villages that are Shia, you have villages that are Sunni. Most of those, the Sunni villages are Bedouin villages that have been settled. The Bedouins in South Lebanon have family members in the interior of occupied Palestine. You have many Christian villages. All the Christian sects are present in South Lebanon. The Maronites and the Catholics and the Orthodox and the Greek Catholics, etc. And you have Druze villages as well. So I try to look beyond sort of the understanding of al-Muqawama, which is also kind of upheld as the ideology and the sort of the presence of Hezbollah in the region, to look at the ways in which people resist at the level of living. And so my discussion, just to answer that question briefly, because I don't want to dominate the Q&A, is that I don't look at Mumana'a. This is relating to a more regional political framing that in my work, of course, resonates, and I often get questions that relate to Syria and the resistance in South Lebanon. But I always insist on reminding people that my focus really is of course, at the politics of the ordinary, the politics of the everyday. And as you saw in the events of the past couple of weeks, indeed, it's this politics of the ordinary and the everyday that has actually preceded, right, the military. So in the return of the villagers to their villages in South Lebanon, it wasn't Hezbollah, it wasn't a military opening, it was the villagers actually marching back into their villages and followed by the Lebanese army, right? So there was something really amazing about this focus, right, to the level of life that has been actually sort of addressed by the Israeli war machine, because they're attacking life itself. They're attacking life at the level of humans and plants and animals and landscape, right? And so to resist, right, this annihilation, people are also responding by insisting on life. And so in a way now the military is taking a back seat a little bit locally, regionally, at the front lines of this conflict, of this war, taking a backseat to the presence of life itself and to the people, the ordinary people who are returning to their villages. And a last personal story is that I had the family that I'm closest to from Ramya were staying with us at my family's home during the war, and in both ceasefires, they were on the road and going back to their village the moment they thought they could, right? The first time they were repelled, and then the second time, there was nowhere to stay or nowhere to go, so they're still not able to go back. But this going back is not a military ideology. It's the desire of people to be back home. And we're seeing this in Palestine as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the images that we've seen since the initial ceasefire in Gaza of people returning to the north, I think speak to that really, really powerfully, Munira. I have a question here from Danny Postal, which I think is going to be put in Olmo's court, but I also welcome Kevin as an Iran expert as well, to comment on this. So from Danny Postal, in Syria and Iraq, Iran has played a decidedly counter-revolutionary role, siding with the oppressors against the oppressed, indeed helping the former crush popular movements of the latter. Elia Ayub calls this resistance, trademark against resistance. The very concept of Iran as a quote unquote revolutionary state in the vanguard of an axis of resistance feels like an instance of what Ulrich Beck called a zombie category, an idea that is dead but somehow goes on living, and asks us to update our categories. I think, as you said, Olmo, this is all, none of this is static, but give you a chance to respond to that.
Yeah, thanks for this. I mean, I really like the idea of the zombie category by Ulrich Beck, which might even help to help us with the idea of resistance, more with the resistance idea than with the axis of resistance, because I would say the axis of resistance is a real thing. I mean, it's not dead, but somehow goes on living, because you have the alliance cohesion, or you had the alliance cohesion for years. We don't know how it's going on. This is probably more in Kevin's court, but I would say the resistance in the region. So the resistance as proposed as a concept, or even the Mostasafin by the Islamic Republic of Iran's propaganda, is in a way such a zombie category. I would totally agree, and it's also important to not only focus on the last 16 months when it comes to Iran's erosion of credibility within this axis of resistance, but to look at the processes in Syria and Iraq long before. I mean, this is why I said Iran was the hegemon in Syria for years now, at least since 2014, 15, maybe 13. So yeah, I totally subscribe to that.
Kevin, do you have a response to that?
Just great question. I agree with Olmo, and I think Danny's absolutely right. And he posted an article there that I'm looking forward to reading. I would just reference also Maryam Alamzadeh's article in this issue as well, who's not here, but I think that piece in many ways is arguing that support for Palestine is kind of a zombie category within Iran, and has been, because it's been so beholden to geostrategic interest, and the gap between propaganda, whether it is the countdown clock in Philistine Square, or it's the sign-up portal where they're going to have people, go fight in Gaza, is just kind of, empty rhetoric. So, yeah, I would take a look at Mariam's piece as well. And I think because there's a lot to be said about how the state in Iran positions itself vis-a-vis Palestine, and how people in Iran and Iranians outside of Iran understand that support. It's a very complicated relationship. And I'll just reference one more piece, a recent piece in Jadaliyah, where a little ethnographic work was done with the Iranian diaspora. And we do see, we have seen a very kind of pro-Israel portion of the Iranian diaspora, but there is quite a bit, as this article highlights, of members of the diaspora across demographics who support Palestine, but have so struggled with the way it's been approached by the Iranian regime. And it's made it so difficult for them to express support and understand what it means to resist and support Palestine, because the issue has been co-opted somewhat emptily as a zombie category by the government. So these are great kind of confounding questions, but I agree overall. I think our categories definitely are due for an update in some ways.
All right, thank you, Kevin. We have about 5 more minutes before we should wrap things up here. So I have one question here, one more for Munira from Ted Swedenberg. He asks, what is the response of Southern villagers to the recent statement by the U.S. Deputy Special Envoy to the Middle East, Ortegas, who praised Israeli victory over Hezbollah in the presence of Lebanese President Aoun?
Right. So that was just an astounding, horrifying, terrible moment, not only for villagers, in the south, but to many Lebanese. It was a performance of, as a friend of mine in Beirut put it, raw colonial rule. I've never seen an American envoy speak in such blatant terms, praising Israel, which is a country that Lebanon as a state is at war with, and that Lebanon as a state doesn't acknowledge, as the hero of this war, while standing in the presidential palace in Lebanon. It was really a mind-blowing moment that really kind of like clarified, and didn't clarify, but like clarified to people who were not paying that much attention, just what where the U.S. stands vis-a-vis its genocidal partner in the region. And in South Lebanon, people are still very much attached to resistance in the actual terms of being back home and going back to their villages and rebuilding, but also to al-Muqawamah. I don't see anybody from the south really budging. Of course, there is a wider there is a kind of a widening, let's say, space between many people who are unquestionably pro-resistance and the latest war. There's been more kind of worry or grumbling around the possibilities of victory in this moment, and the discourse of victory kind of like rings a bit hollow at the level of political discourse. So the lived realities of people, I feel, are where one can really recognize and see resistance as it plays out, but at the level of the larger political players and their rhetoric. Things are kind of shifting, but to just Morgan Ortega's performance was really mind-blowing to all of us, and it really performed a sort of a transgression of Lebanese sovereignty, a very audacious one, and I guess that's the politics of the region, of the U.S. and Israel in the region right now.
Yeah, I mean, if there has been one sort of trademark or watermark of Trump's politics, going back to his first presidency and certainly continuing on into this one, it has been the breaking of norms, right? And in so many ways, right, this was like a really shocking statement, and as you said, a statement of raw colonialism, right?
Right, but also let's not forget that the Democrats were also waging a genocide in between the presidencies. So
yeah. Well, one with norms and one without norms is sort of the point. This is really to say that, like, I think maybe what we're seeing now is that even as sometimes performative those norms are, when they are broken or transgressed, it comes with material consequences, and maybe, hopefully, perhaps this is clarifying for so many people who may have been on the sidelines, who haven't stood up, who haven't gotten up out of their seats as they would in a Sadala Wanus play. So with that, we're at an hour and a half, so I want to keep this thing at least a little bit tight. But I want to thank our contributors, Zach, Kevin, Munira, Olmo, and Marya, who's had to leave. But thank you for such really, really brilliant pieces, comments here in this space. Thank you to those of you in the audience for sticking with us. For your support. Please, read, share, comment, send these pieces around, teach them if you have the opportunity to, and let us know what you think. You can always reach me via the emails that we have on our website or in response to the invitation that you got when you registered for this event. We look forward to putting this on YouTube and gathering again before too long to discuss more work that we're putting out here at Merit before too long. So once again, thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day wherever you are.